What up, what up, what up? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I want to thank you for joining us and welcome you to another edition of the Brothers Briefing, your place for news, views, and lifestyles on Black men and our perspective. I'm your co-host, Charles Coleman Jr., and also joining me as well as my amazing co-host, Mr. Richard Fowler. How are you doing today, brother?
I'm good, Charles. How are you?
I'm good, my friend. I'm good. A lot going on, a lot to talk about, and we also have a special guest. So make sure you stay. But before you do that, take a minute, click that like button, click that subscribe button, click that share button.
Share.
That's right.
Like.
We're here for you.
Phone a friend. And listen, I got to tell you, for all the folks, and you know, we're a small team here. Big shout out to our production team, and all the folks that make this possible. Charles and Fela. Charles and Fela. No, you're Charles. Dennis and Fela. There we go.
Dennis, Fela, Chanel. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the team that make this possible. We're a very small team.
Right.
So for the folks, and so we'll eventually get to TikTok. I know people are like, why aren't y'all on TikTok? We're getting there. But for the folks who are showing us mad love on Instagram, yes, I'm talking to you. Thank you. We have had a lot of love on Instagram, a lot of followers. You guys are in the comments. You guys are debating our videos. And for that, we're grateful. So thank you. Some of you guys are trolling our videos. The trolls showed up. And we're okay with the trolls.
When I knew I had made it, I said a prayer and said, hey, mama, I made it, because we started getting trolled by like Republicans.
Yeah, I saw that.
And actually hardcore conservatives. Like conservative influences are trolling us now. And I'm not going to give them no pub by actually naming names. But all I'm going to say is that there are some prominent conservative influencers who are now trolling us, which I think is hilarious.
Which, you know, that means I guess that means like, look, mama, we made it. Because I mean, I'm used to them trolling, but now they're trolling our podcast, which is, I think, tells you that we we're on their radar, and so they're paying attention, which is good. And that has everything to do with you guys listening, watching, sharing, talking about it. So thank you.
When Black MAGA comes for you, like, that's a boost to your self-esteem. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, all jokes aside, we got a lot to talk about. Richard has not given us an Iran update in some time, and I think that it's important that he get this time to shine. So what's our first story today?
Okay, and in all fairness, this debate, just so you guys understand the making of the sausage here, because I do think that's important, right? We debate the rundown and what goes in the show, and there's a debate every week about whether or not we talk about Iran. And to be fair, I don't think Iran should be in the show every week, but I do think because Iran has, and Charles should tell you why he doesn't think Iran should be in the show, but I do think there are moments where we should talk about Iran because Iran has implications in this moment. If it was someplace else, like if we were having, if we were fighting Australia, I would be reluctant to be like, oh, we should put this in the rundown all the time.
We don't talk about Russia and Ukraine. Fair enough.
Right. But I do think Iran has implications to your dining table. I think Iran has implications, especially as we think about back to school, to picking the kids, dropping the kids off, especially if you have a car that, requires fuel. And I think as we get closer and closer to the Thanksgiving holiday, and as we get close, people have to go to the grocery store every day beyond Thanksgiving. I think there's real implications here. And I think it's important when it is relevant to talk about Iran. So Iran has made the rundown. Charles is like, Iran's in the rundown again. Man, this is his thing. But
if you're out there and you're sort of like listening before you sort of listen and have your opinion or fast forward, I do want you to think about this way. How many people who who look, not just look like, but show up like Richard or myself are having these conversations about international news? And the thing why it's important to understand this is that you can't have it both ways, right? Like, people have come up to me and Richard while we were in the vineyard and, having conversations, and they talk about what's not in the space of mainstream media or what's not in the space of mainstream news. But part of it is that you have to be able to trust that people who are on new media, people who are doing new things like this, who look like me and Richard, are capable of going to these places and having these conversations and analyzing these issues. Believe it or not, there are folks out there who don't think that two Black men could handle that don't think that two Black men are equipped to sort of go there. And I think it's important that we are able to show that we're not. And then also, one thing that we're always going to do is make the connection culturally and contextually to why it matters to you. Richard just talked about some of it being on your table and affecting your wallet and your bank account. And those are the types of connections that we understand are important to you, but that mainstream media isn't always going to touch. I personally think that y'all may not necessarily be that interested, but you should be. And Richard explains why. And that's the sort of weekly conversation that he and I have.
And listen, and you should be, because I think the implications are far-reaching, and implications are far-reaching, and we've been here, which I think pairs into the story. We've been in this Iran situation for just about 6 months now. And remember when we got here, which leads into this story, they said we'd be here for 5 days, 6 days, maybe 7 days. It's been 6 months. We're still here. And what makes this story a moment to make the rundown now is we see this White House once again moving the goalpost on what matters to them and what the goal is of us getting here. So in a couple of interviews, back-to-back interviews, both Vice President J.D. Vance and Donald Trump has changed what they think the goal should be around this conflict. At first, the conflict was a non-nuclear Iran, or this was the goal. We're going to make sure Iran never has a nuclear weapon. Now, as we drag into our 6th month, Vice President J.D. Vance and Donald Trump seem to have paired away, and they've paired back their remarks. And recently, they've offered a list of different priorities, sort of saying, and this is what J.D. Vance said in a quote, and I quote, ensuring that the Gulf countries continue to send oil and gas to the world's economy so that we have energy price stability. That's goal number 1, keeping oil and gas cheap for Americans all over the country. And then obviously goal 2 is ensuring that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. And that shift actually matters here, because initially what we heard in February was we're going to Iran to make sure they never have a nuclear weapon. And this happens when last year, this time, the Trump administration said we had decimated Iran's military. There's no way they can do anything. We've destroyed their nukes. Then they said, well, we're actually going over there to get their nukes. Now they're saying we now can acknowledge that they have nukes, number 1. Number 2, we are acknowledging that we might not get their nukes. And number 3, we're saying, well, maybe the nukes is our second priority. And our first priority is to reopen the Straits of Hormuz in some way, and basically return the world to where it was prior to us getting in there in the first place. Because before this February incident, and it's now war, the Straits of Hormuz was open, oil was free flowing, fertilizer and nitrogen, natural gas was free flowing. When this February conflict started, Iran closed the straits. That caused oil prices to skyrocket. It cost the price of fertilizer for our farmers to almost double. So this was a self-fulfilling prophecy. This was a preemptive strike that was caused by Donald Trump's White House and the Bibi Netanyahu government. Now here we are 6 months later, and they're saying their top priority is to undo what they did in February. And then second to that is, making sure that they don't have a nuke, which was their first priority in February, which is why we got here in the first place, which is a walk back. And it really shows they didn't have a strategy to begin with. But that's why this is in the rundown. Okay.
Well, I think that, but it's very interesting that you say that's why this is in the rundown, because I think it highlights the way that both you and I feel about this on different sides, right? Everything that you went through just now to explain the relevance of where we are and give people an update to understand what's going on with Iran is part and parcel why the reason why people aren't interested, because people don't trust it and they keep seeing that the story continues to change. And what it does for people who are casual observers, not folks who are in the weeds on news like you and I, is it makes people sort of say, this all sounds like a bunch of mess, a bunch of lies, a bunch of backtracking. But here's the most important part, Richard. The fact that there isn't anyone in the congressional arena, in the oversight arena, who's willing to do anything about this substantively is why people are not willing to pay attention. Because regardless of what history says, and regardless of what the president is actually doing that he's not supposed to be doing, or that is deeply problematic, it doesn't matter to the average person if no one's going to do anything about it. So I can backtrack. I can watch the backtrack. I can see the hypocrisy. I can point out the flaws. I can, poke holes in the logic. But if there's no one at the congressional level, there's no one in the Senate, even when given the opportunity to rein the president in, they sort of did a half-assed job about that. If there's no one who's going to make those steps, then it's not going to matter to me because I can't necessarily hope for the things that we would like to prevent to be actually prevented. Now, here's the one thing I'll say, why it does become still relevant. Because of what I just said, because of the fact that you cannot count on Congress or the legislature or, and damn sure not the judiciary, to rein in the president in this moment as it relates to Iran, the reason why you need to listen to these conversations and know what's going on and understand the sort of breadth, scope, and longevity of this is so that you yourself can take the steps that you need to in order to think through how this could affect you and then prepare. That is the one thing I'll say. If you're someone who's interested in politics or has a fleeting interest in what's going on, this may not move the needle for you, and I understand that. But if you are someone who's practically thinking about its application to your everyday life and what it is that you can do to be ready for the difficulty of what it is to have had the straight closed and open and closed and open and what that means for you and your wallet, this is why you need to pay attention to these conversations. But other than that, most folks are like, yeah, the president's he's on one again and Congress ain't gonna do nothing about it.
I think that to that point, and we saw the president in a rally, I think it was late last week, where the president sort of said, gas prices are above $4 and I'm not apologizing for that. So this president is sort of doubling down on this idea that I'm making it harder and I'm making life more unaffordable for the American people. I'm making it more unaffordable for folks who are living paycheck to paycheck. And the hard part about that, Charles, is it's not just poor folks who are living paycheck to paycheck. There are more middle-class families now because of this fluctuation in gas prices that are now living paycheck to paycheck that he is making it harder for. Because if you are somebody, and I mean, my mom was one of these people, she's not retired, but my mom was one of these people that because of hospital closures, she went from working at a hospital that was 20 miles away to working at a hospital that was 50 miles away. And so a fluctuation in gas prices to the tune of $2 a gallon, right, that's a big deal when it takes you, you're filling up your tank 2 or 3 times a week. And so talking to get to work. I'm talking about folks who are living in places like Florida. I'm talking about folks who are living in places like Texas. I'm talking about folks who are living in places like Georgia, in Virginia, places where commuting is part of your experience. I'm not talking about folks who live in big cities where, you could jump on the train or you could take the bus. But if you live in the suburbs, the exurbs, and commuting is part of your story, this affects you in a very, very big way because a dollar fluctuation could end up meaning $20 or $30 every time you show up to the gas pump. And that $20 or $30 could be $60 a week. That $60 a week, that's $120 every 2 weeks, right? That's what, $440 every month. And
I ain't doing the math, but it adds up. I'm not doing the math. It adds up.
I mean, my math is off. That's $120 every 2 weeks. That's $240 every month. Either way, this is real implications for real people. And you have a president and a White House that has no clue on how to get us out of this. And the impacts are real. So we can move on to the next story.
I get it. We're going to move on to another story that a lot of people would not think makes a lot of sense for us to talk about, but it actually does. Let's talk. You are listening to the Brothers Briefing. You're watching the Brothers Briefing. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. We have a very special guest today. But before we get to that, let's talk about women's bodies. Why not? Because that's what men like to do, right? Let's talk about women's bodies. That intro was insane. That intro was insane. It was so insane. Let's talk about women's bodies and reproduction because men like to talk about that when neither of us have vaginas. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently announced that she was freezing her eggs. She's at the ripe, quote unquote, biological age of 36, and she will soon be 37. And she has decided that she wants to freeze her eggs. I believe she had fairly recently broken up with her fiance, but she's not in a space right now where she sees herself having kids, but apparently wants kids. And so she decided to make this announcement and talk about her journey for reproductive rights, or for her reproductive freedoms in that sense. And predictably, Richard, men on the internet lost their shit. Like I don't get it. It's not my ministry to understand, but in today's world where you do have the science, where you do have the technology, I mean, let's be clear. I just want to get past all of this so we can get to our guest. This is about men who want to have an unreasonable level of concern and involvement and control over the bodies of all women, not even women that they're involved with. Like, you don't even know AOC, and you're worried
I don't
about
understand.
her eggs. I don't get it.
I don't understand. And one of these conservative commentators said the following. He'll remain nameless. I won't name check him, but I will say his quote. She'll be 37 in a couple of months. If she gets pregnant now, it would be technically a geriatric pregnancy. Instead, she'll freeze her eggs. This desire to start having children late in life is completely baffling to me. I'll have kids in their 20s by the time I turn 50. AOC's apparently wants to have a toddler at that age. Totally backwards, totally ridiculous. And for me, Charles, the hypocrisy here among some of these individuals, right, as you hear the vice president talking about, oh, we need to have American families and we want to protect the family. Yeah. And so now you have a leader in the country, right? I would say one of the leading women in the country, one of the loudest voices in the country, who's a female leader, saying, I'm going through this process of freezing my eggs because at some point in time, I want to start a family, which is what you hear people like J.D. Vance saying you should do. And she's being condemned for starting a family when their main argument is you should start a family. The hypocrisy here is rich.
The hypocrisy is that when they say you should start a family, what they're saying is that men should start families. Like, what they're saying is that they don't mean her.
Just need the woman. First of all, they just need the woman to procreate the family. They don't mean
her. They just need her, like, not even participation, her presence, I guess, right? Like,
it's baffling.
So it's baffling in as much as we see this conversation from a number of different factions, and it's always justified in so many different ways, right? Like, there's this Christian nationalism justification for it that makes no sense. Then there is this outright and unabashed misogynistic, patriarchal, sort of structural justification, which also makes no sense, right? And then quietly, the other part that a lot of people aren't talking about and that we didn't touch is that on the right, for a lot of people, it is sort of this, there's a subtext of white replacement theory that's undergirding this as well. When you hear it being talked about and parroted from certain people on the right, they're like, we need white people to start having families. We don't need no more Latin babies. We don't need no more black babies. We need white people to start having families. That's why AOC, we're going to act crazy about you freezing your eggs. And then also, here's the other thing about it. For anybody who's listening, who's as puzzled as Richard and I are about this, even though these are AOC's eggs, it's not a man making the decision. She's the one making the decision, right? Like, that's also why it's a problem. Like, how dare you take control over your own sort of reproductive decisions absent the presence of any man in your life? And I think that incenses a number of, like, it's the epitome of little dick energy, if you ask me. And in large part because I think some of them are worried, like, damn, if she can decide to do this and take this level of ownership and personhood and agency over herself, what about the women who I want to get pregnant and have babies with, whatever? What if they decide to do the same thing? It is pure prime little dick energy, in my opinion. And that's what
so all the men out there who think that, like, taking the stance of the conservative commentator that I just mentioned is the right way to go, and to think that that's going to, like, make you a strong man and attract women to, like, your beck and call. No, it's not. Because take it from me, but two, you don't have to. All the polling tells you that what women are looking for in this moment is women see career advancement as the number one thing, and they see family and everything else as number two. And I think that poll would change when men start to see women as one equal to them. And two, they have the same level of smarts, same level of intelligence. Their reproductive health matters as much as your health. And when you can see them on the same level as yourself, that is when they will be attracted to you. But when you start to downgrade them and look down on them, or start to say that, oh, well, if she decides to have a baby at this age, that's baffling to me. You also unattract all the women who are younger than you, or who are your age, who are like, oh, well, I don't want to get with you because you don't. If you're saying that about her, what are you going to say about me?
They don't think that far. I mean, they're not used to this. These are not men who are, you can tell, are used to getting sex. I do. The last thing I'll say on this, because I know that there are a lot of white men who are especially interested in this conversation, which is weird to me. I really, we talk a lot about the trauma of Black men and Black boys with respect to issues that they might have with their mothers. I don't understand how you as a white man could have this conversation with your mother unless she was also a little bit thrown off, and not with a straight face sort of realize how ridiculous you sound, trying to control her body. But hey, maybe you grew up in a household where your mom also co-signed on this like deeply seated level of patriarchy, like to the point that like her own body doesn't belong to her and her own choices aren't hers to make. I certainly did not. That was not my mother. But
not mine either.
Right.
And listen, and I will say this: my mother's somebody who, as you know, y'all heard talk about. She was a NICU nurse. My mom has always said one thing to say, and I'll tell you, my mom did not start as somebody who. My mom will tell you she's not necessarily somebody who's pro-abortion, but what she will say is, I am pro-choice because I believe once I close the door between me and my doctor, that's our conversation. It's nobody else's business. And I have two sisters. And for those two women in my life, I think they deserve every right to do what they want to do with their body, period, point blank, end of story. And any man that they're with who says that my two sisters don't have the right to do what they want to do with their body, me and them, we have a problem. We have beef. We have real beef.
I can't imagine.
We have real beef.
I can't imagine. I can't imagine a world.
Real beef. So if you're one of those men, just know real beef. We have real beef. Real beef.
I can't imagine a world where somebody would tell me what I can and can't do with my penis. So because I don't have a vagina, I am not interested in doing the same to a woman. So is what it is. But we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we are being joined by New York Times opinion columnist Jamelle Bouie. And I'm super excited for the conversation we're going to have. Please stay tuned. You're listening to The Brothers Briefing. We'll be back. Welcome back. You're watching The Brothers Briefing, news, views, and perspective as far as Black men are seeing it in full view. I am your co-host, Charles Coleman Jr. And of course, joining me is Richard Fowler. And we have an amazing guest that we are talking to today. You may have seen me interview him on MS Now at some point, I believe. But now he's here joining us on The Brothers Briefing. You also may see him on Instagram doing very good content while he's walking his dog and giving opinions. We have the one, the only, the amazing Jamelle Bouie, who is here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome him to The Brothers Briefing. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you so much.
Jamelle, welcome to the show. How are you?
It is a nice day here in Virginia. I'll say that.
Amen.
We appreciate that. I'll just get right into it. You are someone who works in print journalism, giving opinions a lot. And you work for a platform that sometimes catches heat for some of its position in some of its positions in a media landscape, if you will, that has a lot of pressure coming down on it from the executive branch. Like the fourth estate is under attack. Does that concern you? Like how does that affect or impact your calibration to like what you talk about and how hard you may go when you're sitting down to like think through a piece?
Yeah, I mean the White House's or the president's sort of disdain or hatred for the media is like a real thing, but it's not something I think about or factor in anything I write. It doesn't. I've never once it's my second term Trump, and I was at the Times for the last 2 years of the first Trump administration. At no point in any of my time writing with Trump in the White House have I ever thought to myself, I should tone this down because the White House might get mad. So it literally is just nothing that I think about whatsoever. And I'm not gonna start, in part because I'm not gonna say like their bark is worse than their bite, but like they do bark a lot,
Yeah.
And I don't know how useful it is to respond to all the barking. And if they do decide to bite, then, take that on as it comes, but I'm not going to worry about it.
Yeah. I do think that the bark in part is a means of trying to sort of prevent people going to the next step where they either have to make the decision to bite or not. So it's kind of like the bark is literally, let me see how many people I can scare off with the bark, even as the bite may be whatever it is. But, it's good to hear that from you in terms of that.
I say the fact of the matter is that they went after a Washington Post reporter, right? They sent the FBI to raid this woman's home, and it was a huge scandal. It resulted in a ton of bad press for the administration. They have tried to sue New York Times reporters. It never works out for them. Courts don't take it seriously. And so I think it's always important to remember that they operate with political constraints too, right? Like, in the highly unlikely event that I were trying to leave the country or whatever, and like got arrested, it would be like a major national story that no one wants to deal with on their side. Like they don't want to deal with that. Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize that fact that they do not operate free of political constraints in the same way that we don't.
So talking about like the Trump administration, how they operate, right? I mean, what we've seen them actually where they've had a lot of success, I think regrettably for a lot of Americans, is their implementation of Project 2025, right? Which is a sort of a plan sort of written and sort of drawn up. The architects of that was the Heritage Foundation and folks from Trump One. And they've had a lot of success. I mean, that's the only thing you can say, how they've been able to sort of take down USAID, take down a lot of smaller agencies, reshape regulation, change how committees and commissions inside the federal government have been structured. In response to that, what we've seen, and you wrote about this in early June, we've seen Democrats or progressives try to sort of say, we're going to have our project 2020, 2029 or 2030 or 2036 or 2050, whatever the hell. Right. And what you write and what I found to be striking, because I think there's so much truth to it, is, and I'm going to quote you here, is so far, unfortunately, it's not the Reconstruction agenda that the country needs. It's more so a whole bunch of policy documents. And I want to just double tap and key in on this. I would love for you to talk about it some more, because I think what progressives are falling into is their usual, well, here's a policy prescription for that, and here's a policy prescription for this, wherein Project 2025, when you read the 400-page document, chapter by chapter, is almost like a new doctrine for how they want the country to run, how they want the country to operate, how they believe the American people should interact with their government, and how they're implementing that with Russell Volt and others in a very meaningful, fast-paced way. And to be fair, how we've already started changing to, or how we started adapting to that, and how we interact with our government.
Yeah, the administration, they have this vision of presidential dictatorship is the best way to describe it. That, Congress is a subordinate institution. The courts mainly exist to protect the president's prerogatives, and then the president can, operate the entire executive branch as basically an extension of his person, and can do whatever he wants within that. Can spend however he wants to spend. Can ignore Congress. Can delete programs, destroy programs for agencies as he sees fit. Just a vision of presidential dictatorship. And Project 2025, the intellectual architecture rather, is all geared towards how do you use the existing materials of the American state to create a presidential dictatorship. And current Democratic efforts to think about a post-Trump era tend to take the perspective of return to normalcy. How can we get back to the status quo before Trump? But there needs to be recognition that, first, I don't think there's going back to the status quo before Trump. I think that's dead and gone.
Yeah.
That second, the architecture that the administration will have built for presidential dictatorship will remain, right? It's not going to just fade away, go away. And if you, as I do, think that that's bad, just on kind of a basic dictatorship is bad. It's not good to have. It's not good to have unaccountable executive power, but also that kind of authority actually lends itself very well to extremely right-wing politics, and not actually that well to left-wing politics, to more progressive politics. If you have that view, then you have to be thinking about not just how do you get rid of the architecture of presidential dictatorship, but like what alternative architecture do you have in mind for thinking about how we should structure the government? Like, what does progressive governance actually look like beyond policy, but thinking about the actual institutions and structures of government and the assumptions built in? And that's where I think there just has not been very much, big picture thinking among Democrats. And that's where I think the big picture thinking is needed. For my part, I think I maybe gestured towards this in the piece. I don't remember. It's been a minute. But I think when you look at sort of the history of progressive change in this country, legislative change, so you're thinking the 1866 to 1876 roughly, so Reconstruction, you're thinking the New Deal, thinking the Great Society. The thing that unifies all three of those periods is there are times when Congress isn't just a powerful institution, but maybe the preeminent institution, where so much of what's driving American politics and American policy is what Congress wants to see happen, what lawmakers are trying to bring into being. And the executive is really it's not quite subordinate. That's not the wrong way to describe FDR, for example. But the executive branch, even if it's not subordinate, is like sharing the driver's seat with Congress. It's both are kind of engaged in governing, and one isn't subordinate to the other. And I do think that provides a model for how we ought to think about a post-Trump moment. That when you look at all the things that people are very upset about and angry about, they do come down to the fact that you have unaccountable executive power and unaccountable judicial power. And I think that the remedy to that is accountable power of the legislature, of Congress.
Jamal, go ahead. I'm very fascinated by that point, because it is something that I had thought through on a different sort of level. Just that one of the failures I see in opportunities for progressive politics on the left is to present an affirmative vision that allows people to sort of reimagine something. And it seems like in that way, the Heritage Foundation, the right, they have been sort of leaps and bounds ahead of like, we're not going to sort of just wait for you to tell us what you want. We're going to construct something. We're going to sell it to you. We're going to tell you how it's going to work. And then we're going to actually do it. And I don't necessarily know that the left has even thought its way through envisioning what that looks like, let alone how it would work or bring about it. What I'm concerned with now, that I'm curious to get your reaction to, is now that we have seen the limits of government pushed, we've seen the limits of the executive expanded, in part from some very shrewd, some very ruthless, and in some cases relentless pushing. I know that there are people on the left who want to see their heroes, their leaders, their elected officials act with the same level of fervor on the opposite end, with the same degree of engagement when and if there is a return to power from the left. I don't know, in the spirit of quote unquote democracy, however you want to define that, that's particularly helpful. But I also don't know that now that we've seen what's possible, that for those people, they can sort of step back and say, oh, I know that they pushed the limits on government and basically shredded many of our institutions. But now that we are in charge, we want to return to civility, also understanding that return to civility will inevitably slow the return and the rebuilding of whatever was torn down.
Yeah. I I sort of two thoughts. The first is that it is always easier to destroy than to build, just as a matter of fact, you know. Mm-hmm. And when you look at what the administration's done over the last year, other than ICE and Customs and Border Protection, other than basically beefing up those two institutions, they haven't really built anything, right? No. And I'll note that they didn't do the building up of ICE and DHS through executive order. They did it by law, right? Congress passed a law, and then that's how that went forward. But otherwise, it's all been destructive. It's all been destructive of the administrative state, destructive of the federal bureaucracy, destructive of so many things. Which brings me to my next point. A good reason for all that destruction, and the reason why, for example, the Republican Congress didn't do much about it beyond agreeing, is that historically speaking, Republican presidents have always had this very adversarial relationship with the federal administrative state. They don't like conservatives don't like the EPA. There's no world in which they enjoy the EPA. And beginning like ever since Reagan, you know, Nixon signs it into law. Nixon just generally doesn't give a shit about that stuff. So he signs it into law. And then we have Ford, who's another kind of very moderate Republican, Carter. Reagan is the first like recognizably conservative Republican president. And he gives over the EPA to an administrator who is opposed to the EPA, right? But even that administrator has to work within the law. Even that administrator has to deal with these constraints. And as much as Republicans have disliked the EPA or disliked the National Labor Relations Board or disliked the Food and Drug Administration and all these agencies, they hadn't figured out a way to deal with them outside of getting Congress to pass a law, which wasn't going to happen. And so they've had this adversarial relationship with them in which they don't like the agencies. They don't like the agencies' missions. They want to undermine those missions as much as possible. And with Trump, the innovation is just to say, well, we're just going to dismantle them unilaterally and dare anyone to stop us. And if you have control of Congress, then that Congress isn't going to try to stop you. For Democrats and Democratic presidencies, they've never had that kind of relationship with the administrative state because the administrative state has done things that they wanted to do, right? Democrats want environmental regulation and protection. They want regulation of the food supply. Like they want these things. And so there's a kind of a level of the Democratic Party and the administrative state being sympactical with each other that you don't necessarily need. Like Democrats have never felt the need to try to develop theories of an autocratic president because they can work with the administrative state just fine. It works with their priorities. And so some of what is driving the Trump and Project 2025 is a response to the fact that Republicans really want to get rid of the administrative state, can't do it legislatively, and can't figure out any other way to do it than just tearing it down. And when you imagine a Democratic president is going to want a functional bureaucracy because to do the kinds of programs progressives want to do, you need state capacity, right? You need a government that can work. And people love Mamdani, rightfully so. Mamdani's success is a lot about the capacity of New York City bureaucracy just to do things. And what he's doing is he's utilizing that capacity to its fullest, but it needs to be there. So there's a way that like you can imagine a Democratic president trying to utilize some of the more unilateral authority that Trump has accumulated. But on a very practical level, that Democratic president is really going to want a functional administrative state. Is really going to want like bureaucrats know what they're doing. Is really going to want all that stuff. And is going to want things to move through the rule of law for purely practical reasons. I think beyond that, and this gets to it's easier to destroy than the build point. Like if you want your legacy to be lasting, it kind of has to come through law, right? If the Social Security Act were somehow an executive order, it would have been dead decades ago. The fact that it's a law and a successful one makes it difficult to dislodge. Obamacare, right, is difficult to dislodge. They've been trying to do it for over 15 years now, 16 years, and haven't managed it because it's actually that difficult to tear up a law once it's already on the books. So I do think that for as much as I think the political left is going to want to see a Democratic president act unilaterally for like practical reasons, I don't know that that's going to make a lot of sense. I think what lesson you can take from Trump is less the unilateralism and more the just do things. Just pass the law, right? Don't get caught up into all the, what if this happens? What if that happens? What about opposition? Just do it.
So, I guess that brings me to my next question, right? Because I think this sort of creates the complication for Democrats, both as they have to, one, govern if in a world in which, they take the majority after this November election, and two, if they take the presidency. And I think where you saw it come to a head recently, Hakeem Jeffries did a Meet the Press interview where he asked all these questions about Medicare for all and this and that. And they don't, to the point of your piece, they don't really have a clear agenda of what they want to do. It seems very clear that the Democratic leader wants to sort of turn the clock back. If he, in his ideal world, let's turn the clock back to 2013, the sort of, right around the heyday of the Obama administration. And let's talk about the Obamacare subsidy. Let's not try to do any wishful thinking of what a future could look like when the Democratic voter has seen this administration sort of via executive order rip apart the Department of Education and other administrations, et cetera, and other agencies, et cetera. And two, at the same point in time, for them to get the things that their voters really want, they're going to have a functioning Department of Education. They're going to have a functioning EPA. They might have to create some more new agencies to fulfill the request of their most fervent voter. So how do they do both in a world in which they're not imagining something new and they really want to turn the clock back? When I think if you look to voters, take Michigan, take New York, right? Take Colorado, are saying we want something different, and we're not going to fall into the maybe tomorrow or maybe we'll tomorrow to get that.
For part of this, I don't necessarily know. If Democrats win Congress, right? Trump will still be the president. So some of this is just no one needs to know right now. You know what I mean? It's sort of like there's not going to be any positive legislation happening over the next 2 years if Democrats win Congress. It's really going to be a very adversarial relationship. Some of it is that so much of this is going to be structured by the priorities of whoever's president. I do think that there has to be some kind of conversation now about prioritization and what you would address first, because you only get a shot at a couple things. Just again, this is very practical. Like there's only so much floor time, right? There's only so much time. You have 2 years at the start of a presidency to really get a lot of stuff through. And really it's less, that's 18 months. And there may not be a full party consensus on, say, Medicare for all. And so what's the alternative to that? Is it Medicaid for kids? Maybe it's something, but you may not be able to get Medicare for all. And then there are these other questions. What about the Supreme Court? Do we do Supreme Court reform? Do we do a big voting rights bill? Do we get rid of partisan gerrymandering? Like these questions of political reform and institutional reform. Are we going to, we have to rebuild the Department of Justice. Are we going to do that and then try to prosecute, Trump administration crimes? Like what kind of stuff? Like, unfortunately, any post-Trump period is going to be a total fucking mess for the country.
That's right.
Yeah, and I want to jump in with you there, because as you're talking, the thing that comes to mind now is more so than ever, for a lot of reasons, for the way that we're socialized, for the way that we get information, for the way that people sort of expect to be in touch and have updates and sort of like the news cycle. There is a hunger and a thirst for genuine like red meat that the American electorate has, that I don't know that you quell that appetite with some sort of return to civility. So I do agree that it is going to be a mess, because at this point, the capacity of the American voter, of the American citizen who has been around for the last, 16 years and watching stuff take place, the pendulum has just shifted so far away from what we may remember before, 2015, if you will, that whatever it is that we see, whether it's leadership from the right or the left, is still going to be a far cry away from whatever we thought was the normalcy of before. And my question to you, Jamelle, is, when you are thinking about that, have we just entered a space where the need for satiating your base and providing that sort of like really juicy, sensationalized red meat is just now a part of the landscape and it's not going anywhere, ad nauseum?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think it always has been. I actually think that one of the flaws Democrats have had in power is that they just don't recognize the importance of actually sort of performing politics, like showing people that you're doing stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm going to use Mamdani as an example here again, because I find him so interesting. He ran on these three big promises, free, city-run grocery stores, free buses, and freeze the rent. And the thing about those promises is that, the buses thing requires some cooperation between MTA, New York City, Albany. It's actually kind of a complicated thing to do. The city groceries, though, that's kind of a pilot program. You get some money and then you open it up and you see how it goes. You utilize the fact that New York owns public land and can reduce, can save money that way. And then freeze the rent is just already authority the mayor has that you can just use. And one thing Mamdani's done, and I guess he's been in office for 8 months now, is he's done a lot of stuff using authority the mayor already has, using programs already in place, but that either weren't being pushed to their fullest or just nothing ever got publicized. You would do something and no one talked about it. So he would do the stuff that was already kind of getting done, but then to publicize it and be like, look at what we're doing. And I think that's a real lesson for any future Democratic presidential administration, is that there are going to be constraints, right? There are going to be things that you may not be able to do quickly, but you can utilize your existing authority to its fullest extent. And you can just publicize the things that are going to get done regardless. One, helpful thing in this regard is that because so much of the administration's destruction has been through executive action, through firing people, through just not spending the money. As far as the laws are concerned, the laws are still in the books. So if, for example, the Department of Education's hollowed out, there's still a statute establishing a Department of Education with the full funding stream. So what you do is you rebuild it, and then you brag about it, and you say, look, we are providing aid to students who have student loans. This is already on the books. This is already you're not doing anything new, but you are doing something that's already within your authority, and you can publicize it and you can talk about it and that kind of thing. And I kind of think that just in terms of the politics of giving people the red meat, just constantly showing what you're doing, even if it isn't new, is sort of an advantage here. I do think that a big showy piece of reform is going to be useful here. That's why I think where there's sort of consensus, which is gerrymandering reform, voting rights, Supreme Court reform. You just do those things quickly and you say, look what we're doing. Because first, those things don't really require money. Second, there is a consensus there. And third, it satisfies a deep desire among Democratic voters for those kinds of big reforms. So I think you can do that on the outset. And the bigger, more complicated stuff, healthcare reform, you can kind of handle in the same way that Mamdani is handling buses. That's still in negotiations. You can handle healthcare reform after you've kind of made a splash with this other stuff.
So I guess this sort of brings the next question, and something I think our audience is thinking about, right? What the Democratic Party has turned into while they've been in the minority has been this party that, as even in Trump 1, we saw the sort of beginnings of this. And I think we saw this during the Biden administration, the party of the institution, the party that that supports the FBI, the party that supports a justice department or a justice system that works, or depending if you're a black man, that doesn't work. Right. And I think as you talk to so many of the American voters, especially black men specifically, they see problems. I mean, there was problems with the Department of Education before Donald Trump dismantled. Right. We had a problem with standardized testing and how it showed up for black men and for black boys that turned into black men. And so as this administration, if there's a world in which Democrats win the majority back, you'll see hearings where they are propping up an institution that for many black voters, black men specifically, have a problem with. And so I think the Democratic Party in this moment they're going to be walking a really interesting tightrope where their most loyal voters they have a problem with Trump. They have a problem with this sort of fast-paced dismantling of things, but they also had a problem with the institutions to begin with because of how they were structured, for the fact that they were not built centering the lived experience of black folk. So how did the Democratic Party balance those two things? Because I think in this moment, they're very short-sighted to that fact. They will very quickly say, we like the FBI, and then you'll have black people be like, well, wait a minute now. We didn't like them when they were wiretapping BLM, or when they were wiretapping Martin Luther King. So maybe not. So the question then becomes is, how do you do both? And when you're rebuilding, how do you create a world in which you'll very likely be a white person maybe sitting in the Oval Office and under the Democratic ticket, that's what happens? How do you balance those two things, understanding that it's very likely if the Democratic Party does retake the White House, it will be because of high turnout amongst black folks all across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you're thinking about rebuilding, it's rebuilding with the constructive critiques in mind. Right, rebuilding not to get back to a long gone status quo or prior status quo, but to recreate, rebuild, reconstruct with the critiques in mind. And so they use the Department of Education as an example. The purpose of the DOE is to enforce civil rights law in education. That's its purpose. And so a rebuilt DOE should take that much more seriously, should be much more aggressive about enforcing civil rights law in education, and taking much more seriously, what the federal government can do about gross disparities and outcomes amongst Black Americans and other Americans. And that goes for a whole host of other agencies. I think of the, Housing and Urban Development, which is also being dismantled.
Yep.
That is an agency which is in desperate need of reform, of a new way of thinking about what to do about the federal intervention into American housing markets, into helping people just afford rent. And this is, again, where legislation comes in as well, right? If I were advising a program for, reconstructing DOH, it would be, or HUD rather, it would be first something that would, make Section 8 housing vouchers more like SNAP, which is to say, as soon as you go under an income threshold, you just automatically get it. You don't have to go through hoops. It's just, there's no line, there's no waiting list. You get the subsidized housing voucher, and you can just use it. Laws that, better regulate landlords so that they're not rejecting that sort of stuff. Thinking about how you can rebuild this with an eye towards making the programs it's meant to affect much more effective and much more helpful for people. I think is the way you go about that. I think the wrong approach is to say, well, everything was fine before Trump, and we got to get back to that. That's not. I feel like
that's the assumption that I think we're living under. And you're watching Democratic leaders, we just saw this on Meet the Press, where you're watching Democratic leaders sort of act as if we rewind the clock back to middle of Obama's second term, we lived in this perfect, utopia, and that's where we want to go back to.
I agree, but I think that's really the responsibility of the electorate to make clear to the people who they're thinking about putting in office and having conversations with. And I think that they're doing that.
That's my point, Charles. I think the electorate is sending the message. I don't think the leadership has gotten the message. I think the electorate is
sending the message. I don't know if they're getting it.
One thing I'll say here is that the leadership isn't the only people in Congress. For the past 10 years, we've been in this sort of, in the past 20 years, we've been in this sort of congressional era where the leadership do dominate. But first of all, that's not the only way you could organize a Congress. And second of all, that's not how Congress is organized for most of its history. Like in the heyday of the Great Society during the New Deal, the leadership was just there to organize votes. The people who ran Congress effectively were committee chairs and subcommittee chairs. And I do think that part of like the kind of better government that folks want is going to be one where actually you do reduce the influence of the leadership and empower individual members, because this is where individual members can really matter, right? Like if you're an individual member who cares a lot about housing and urban development, then in a Congress where individual members are empowered, you can do a lot. And that's in the past, that's actually how a lot of things have happened. Not so much the legislative leadership is farsighted, but that the individual members are empowered to address problems as they see them. So I mean, I would say this isn't like to excuse the poor rhetoric of Democratic leadership, but to say that I do think there's a conversation. We have to have better Democratic leadership. We have to replace Jeffries. I actually think the problem is a House and a Senate in which all the power is concentrated in the leadership to begin with, which ends up meaning that it doesn't matter who you elect beyond that because they just don't have any influence. Like Jeffries matters so much because of that. And you could just as easily have a Congress where he just doesn't matter that much. He organizes the votes, right? He sequences the votes, but the people who matter are the people running the committees, the people running the subcommittees.
I think to your point, I think we're so used to, and I'll say this, and maybe, I like her a lot, but I think we're used to a Pelosi-Reed era of leadership, which is it's centralized in the two leaders' office versus, to your point, more of an era where it wasn't that way. But for modern Democratic congressional ruling, it has been under this Pelosi-Reed, which then becomes Schumer era, which is everything comes to the leader's office and we work out of here. Y'all don't do nothing. Just I tell y'all what to do. I liked her, by the way.
You're listening to the Brothers Briefing podcast, news, views, and lifestyles. New York Times opinion columnist Jamelle Bouie is with us. You have been amazing, sir, for this conversation. I want to tell you, as a reader and as a fan, I appreciate the breadth of perspective that you offer at the Times. Keep doing what you're doing. It is a model in so many different ways of the various iterations of how Black manhood can show up without necessarily having to announce itself, but just sort of validating its own self through the things that it does. So I want you to know that from a reader, from intellectual, from a just another space of being a brother, you make us proud.
Thank you so much. That's so nice to hear.
So. And I think it's important for us to have these conversations amongst brothers about the fact that we should be talking about what the future Congress looks like.
Absolutely.
And how it impacts us. Because if we're not having this conversation here, then my friend, we're going to be on the menu and not at the table.
That's right.
That's exactly right.
Stay tuned. We've got a little bit more on the Brothers Briefing as we wrap up with our fast break. We'll be right back after a short break. It is that time, ladies and gentlemen, for our fast break session.
Boom, boom, boom,
fast. Lightning round. What do you got, Richard?
Here's the first story for you, Charles. Weed is on the ballot. Don't smoke it. Just vote for it, I guess. Marijuana is becoming a midterm issue, but here's the twist. Some voters aren't deciding whether to legalize it. They're deciding whether to roll legislation back. In Massachusetts, voters could repeal recreational marijuana sales and home growing while keeping medical cannabis. Idaho has a measure aimed at giving lawmakers more power to block future marijuana ballot issues, and cannabis is showing up in governor's races in Kansas and Iowa. Nationally, 64% of Americans support legalization, but Republican support has dropped sharply from 53% to 40%. Here's a quick take. Weed used to be one of those issues where public opinion was moving basically in one direction. This election may tell us whether the consensus is starting to crack. With that being said, the White House has shown some movement on marijuana, on reclassifying it. And listen, I got to tell you, I think that's going to be the floodgate. Whichever president is willing to say, we will reclassify weed from its current schedule to another schedule, making it more so like, Tylenol and other things versus where it is now, where it's sort of classified with heroin, methamphetamine, and other bad drugs.
I just don't see why this is still a conversation, but it's
really waiting on the federal government. It's the federal government needs to make a move here. This is all the states are doing this in lieu of the federal government changing the Controlled Substances Act. And could be done by the act of the president, just saying, correct, I'm going to reschedule where marijuana goes because everybody's doing it.
Story 2 on our fast breaks. Canada and Trump are back in a tariff standoff. I know this is exciting, guys, but it's important stuff for you to know. The U.S. and Canada are racing toward another trade deadline. President Trump is threatening 50% tariffs on certain Canadian goods starting Wednesday, unless the two countries reach a deal. The immediate tariffs would affect only about 5% of the roughly $382 billion, that's with a B, in Canadian goods imported into the U.S. last year. But business leaders are worried because the bigger casualty could be the integrated North American trade relationship. That is a big deal. Quick fact, Canada isn't some distant trading partner. We build cars together, we share energy markets, and we have supply chains that literally cross the border multiple times. Ask the people in Detroit. A tariff at the border can eventually become a higher price at the register. So that's why this is a story that matters to you.
And we're sending prayers out to the Ardare family, and I hope I pronounce his name right. Jason Ardare, who became Cambridge's youngest ever Black professor, died at just 41. His death comes a little more than a week after he resigned amid allegations of plagiarism and questions about his academic qualifications. Police say his death is unexpected, but does not believe to be suspicious. His family says Ardare has endured sustained abuse and campaigns of misinformation. And now there is a much larger conversation happening in Britain about academic accountability, race, and DEI. And when legitimate scrutiny turns into an online pylon. And I think this sort of is one of those moments where we're seeing when academic integrity is happening to one race versus when it's happening to another race. And there's two things can be true. A university has an obligation to investigate serious questions about academic integrity, and we should also examine those questions when they become public campaigns to destroy a person, especially, Charles, when their race is involved, and especially when they're a brother, which we know comes with extra scrutiny to get to that level in academia. And so we're sending prayers out to him and his family. And we should also be raising an eyebrow to many of these institutions and how they choose to go about these investigations, especially when it's brothers and the impacts could be in this point.
Tons of examples here. But I do want to make a shameless but important personal plug. This week's State of the Sun's Black Man in America is a post about health and wellness. And one of the things that I talk about in that post, if you're following me on IG, is the rates at which Black male suicide and unaliving have skyrocketed among our adolescents and our young men ages 20 to 24. It is a category that we are leading in American life, even though this happened overseas in the UK. It still is something that Black men are facing as a global crisis, and we need to be aware of it. So if you can, check that out. And for our last fast break for today, Michigan's Senate race is already a nail biter. We finally have the first major poll since Abdul El Sayed mollywopped Haley Stevens and won the Democratic nomination for the Senate in Michigan. And this thing, ladies and gentlemen, is close. A new Fox News poll from Democrat Abdul El Sayed and Republican Mike Rogers essentially locked in a tight race, and it's setting up one of the biggest Senate contests for the midterms. Both candidates have some vulnerabilities when it comes to voters. Quick take. Everybody wanted to know whether El Sayed's progressive politics could survive a statewide general election in Michigan. We don't have the answer yet, but certainly the first polling says that this is absolutely a race.
It was going to be close to begin with, though, Charles. This race was never ever going to be, a basket for anybody. I do think for El Sayed, he has some work to do in places like Wayne County, where he has to reassure Black voters, and he has to reassure Stevens voters that he's their guy.
He's the guy, and she's got to help with that. She's got to help with that.
She's absolutely got to. And I also think, he's got to also tease out some of Mike Rogers' negatives here. This is a guy that's flip-flopped on Trump. This is a guy who doesn't really live in Michigan. He moved back. He lived in Florida, made a lot of money. And so I think he's going to have to tease out the distinctions between him and Mike Rogers. But this race is going to be tight as a tick, or as they say in good times, tighter than pantyhose, two sides are small. But watch it. We're watching it.
I didn't even know you was old enough to watch Good Times. Anyway,
I've watched every single episode of Good Times, my friend. Twice.
We've covered everything from AOC's eggs to authoritarianism to El Sayed to Good Times. And that's why you come to the Brothers Briefing. News, views, and perspective. Black men in full view. It's so good that you joined us. So good to have us. Make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, make sure you share it.
Subscribe.
I'm your host, your co-host, Charles Coleman Jr. And of course, that is my main partner in crime, my main man, my co-host, Richard Fowler. We are the Brothers Briefing.
Buddy.
And we will see you next week.
Good. See you later.
Peace.